champions. I'm Amy Morgan, the feature writer for the Marriage Initiative. I am absolutely thrilled today to introduce you to Dr. Gary Chapman, who probably needs no introduction at all, although he deserves one. So I'm going to go ahead. Gary Chapman, Ph.D., venerated counselor, pastor, speaker, and best-selling author, can be considered a founding father in the field of family and relationship ministry. He's best known for developing the 5 love languages concept. His book by the same name, The 5 Love Languages, published in 1992, continues to sell more copies each year than the one preceding. It's now been continually in print for 30 years, sold more than 20 million copies in English, and has been translated and published into 57 languages worldwide. Since the success of this book, Dr. Chapman has expanded the Love Languages series to specifically reach out to teens, singles, men, children, and military families. Many of Dr. Chapman's 59 titles were inspired by his work, either counseling or leading groups, in his 50 years on staff at Calvary Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, from which he officially retired in July 2021. He began speaking at marriage conferences in the 1980s, work he still continues as he leads at least 15 a year still. Dr. Chapman's nationally syndicated radio programs, Building Relationships with Dr. Gary Chapman and the Love Language Minute Daily, air nationally on Moody Radio Network and over 400 affiliate stations, and can also be accessed via podcast. He recently published his memoir, Life Lessons and Love Languages, What I've Learned on My Unexpected Journey. Dr. Chapman, it is just an honor to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Amy. I am delighted to be with you.
Well, I told you I was going to start out with the question that I first had when I learned that I was going to be fortunate enough to interview you. How did you come up with the 5 love languages concept? It is so ubiquitous. I feel like everybody has heard of it or knows it or has some concept. How did this come up to you? And I have your book right here. I demolished it, of course.
Well, I'm often asked that question. It really grew out of my counseling. In fact, I remember probably 40 years ago now, when a couple came into my office and I had never met them. I found out they'd been married to each other for 30 years. And the wife's complaint was that she didn't feel any love coming from her husband. And she felt so empty inside. And I looked at her husband and he said, I don't understand her. I do everything I can to show her that I love her. And she sits there and says she doesn't feel loved. He said, I don't know what else to do. And I said, well, what do you do? He said, well, I get home from work before she does. So I start the evening meal. Sometimes I've got it ready when she gets home. If not, she helps me. Then we eat. And after we eat, he said, I wash the dishes. He said, on Thursday night, I vacuum the floor. On Saturday, I wash the car. I mow the grass. I help her with the laundry. He went on, and I was beginning to wonder, what does this woman do? It sounded to me like he did everything. And he said, I do all of that. And she says she doesn't feel loved. He said, I don't know what else to do. I looked back at her and she started crying. And she said, Dr. Chapman, he's right. He's a hardworking man, but we don't ever talk. We haven't talked in 20 years. He's always mowing the grass, washing the dishes, vacuuming the floors, always doing something. And I realized here was a sincere husband who was doing everything he knew to do to show his wife that he loved her, and a wife who didn't get it. And after that, I heard similar stories over and over in my office. And I knew there had to be a pattern to it, but I had no idea what it was. Until finally, I sat down and read several years of notes that I made when I was counseling and asked myself the question, when someone said, I feel like my spouse doesn't love me, what did they want? What were they complaining about? And their answers fell into 5 categories. And I later called them the 5 love languages. And I started using that in my counseling. If you want her to feel loved, you've got to express love in her language. If you want him to feel love, you've got to express love in his language. And I would help couples discover each other's language and then challenge them to go home and try it. And sometimes, Amy, they would come back in 3 weeks and say, Gary, this is changing everything. I mean, the whole climate's different now. And then I started using with small groups of couples, and the same thing would happen. And probably 5 years later, I thought, if I could put this concept in a book and write it in the language of the common person, leave out the psychological jargon, maybe I could help a lot of couples I would never have time to see in my office. Of course, little did I know what you said earlier is true. It's gone all over the world in all of these languages. But that's where it came from, out of my counseling.
Well, and it seems, I mean, it's become so ubiquitous. People, tacos are my love language, chocolate's my love language. People, secular people everywhere, just kind of, they may not know every bit of love languages, but I've come across just about everyone seems to know theirs, or they've heard about it. And it's just so interesting because what you said is so true. I think as you're telling the story of the husband and the wife, that is so true. If gifts of service is not your love language, your husband or your wife can do anything in the world, but it's not speaking to your heart.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's such a fundamental need?
Well, I think almost everyone agrees that one of our deepest emotional needs on the human level is the need to feel loved by the significant people in our lives. Children, if they feel loved by their parents, they're going to grow up mentally and emotionally healthy. If they don't feel loved, they're going to grow up with many emotional struggles. And the chances are in the teenage years, they'll be looking for love, in the wrong places. And if you're married, the person who would most like to love you is your spouse. In fact, if you feel loved by your spouse, life is beautiful. And everything is easier to process if you feel loved. If you don't feel loved, but rather you feel like they don't love me, they wish they weren't married to me, life can begin to look pretty dark. And much of the misbehavior in marriage grows out of an empty love tank. So it's just a basic emotional need that all humans have, whatever culture. We all have the need to feel loved by the significant people in our lives.
Well, I love that you brought up culture, because that is a favorite subject of yours as well. You have several degrees in anthropology. And so then when you were translating your books, and 57 languages, they're applicable across all those cultures, perhaps because of your studies and how you knew how to do that?
Well, really, that part, it really shocked me because I am sensitive to cultural differences. So when the first publisher came, which happened to be Spanish, to ask permission of my publisher to publish it in Spanish, my first response was, I'm not sure this works in the Spanish culture. I don't, I discovered this in Middle America, and I don't know if this really works. And they said, well, they've read the book and they like it and they want to publish it. I said, okay. And they did, and it became their bestseller. And in many of the cultures, it's become their bestseller. And so there are different nuances in different cultures, to be sure. Physical touch, for example, there are cultures when you greet someone, a friend, even a friend, you kiss them on both sides of the cheek. Well, we don't do that in a common American culture. And so there's different ways that cultures, express words and touch and all the other things. But it does seem to me that the 5 languages are fundamental to human nature. They're colored by culture. The dialects will be a little different in different cultures, but the 5 languages are really apply in all human cultures.
Well, and I love that you brought up the word dialect, because as we were talking, you've taken this concept and applied it to so many different audiences. Often you'll co-author with somebody who has, expertise in that area, and then apply it across. You talked about children and then teens and the different dialects. Can you talk about some of the different audiences you've applied the love languages concepts to?
Yes, one that is really very popular is applying it to blended families. For example, I've had blended families say to me, Dr. Chapman, I got married. I knew about the love languages, and I knew the love language of my stepchild. But when I tried to speak it, they pushed me away. What's going on? You see, the dynamics are different between a step parent and a stepchild than between biological parents and children. And so one of the things, for example, that we say in that book is you can't, if physical touch is their language, and chances are you try to hug them, they will push you away, because they don't have an emotional bond with you yet. They have one with their biological parent, but not with you. So you have to take baby steps. Maybe give them fist bumps for a while, this little pat on the back for a while. And eventually you work up to where not only will you hug them, but they will hug you. So you have to build those bonds. And I wrote that book with Ron Deal, who has spent over 25 years working with blended families. So I am really, really excited about that application of the 5 love languages. But I've also written books with other co-authors on special needs children and how do you discover their language. A special needs child is much more difficult, but they need love just like any other child. I wrote one also on how this applies in a family where you lose a child to death, either a miscarriage or stillbirth, or a young child gets killed, because mom and dad often processes grief in a different way and they begin to feel unloved by each other. So how the love language can really help in that situation. I wrote one on how it applies to in a home where dementia sets in. I wrote it with a medical doctor whose wife had Alzheimer's at an early age and had it for 9 years before she died. And he actually was the head of the oncology department at the hospital. And he resigned and went back to university, got a master's in counseling, came back and set up the memory counseling program. And when they were first diagnosed and still had cognitive ability, he taught them the 5 love languages so that they got connected emotionally, sometimes deeper than they were for years before. And then we talk about what happens as the brain begins to change. And they still have the ability to feel loved. The emotional part of the brain is still there. So that book is called Keeping Love Alive as Memories Fade, the 5 love languages and the Alzheimer's Journey.
That one really resonated with me, having lost my mom recently to dementia, and how you talked about how that is a time, most of the time you say that the love, a person's love language doesn't change, although teenagers, you mentioned, might learn a different dialect than they did as a child. And so you talked about a little bit how to reach out to them in a different way, but Alzheimer's or dementia is a time when people's love languages do change, right?
They do, because different parts of the brain are being affected, and they will not keep the same love language throughout the journey. But the love languages gives you 5 different ways to attempt to touch them emotionally. And when you do touch them, you will get a response. For example, Dr. Shaw, with whom I wrote that book, he said it near the end of the journey, when his wife was not cognitive and couldn't respond verbally at all. He said when she was healthy, gifts was her number 5 of the 5. It had little meaning to her. But at the end of the journey, when he would give her an ice cream cone, she would say, ooh, ooh, ooh. He said, I could live on that for 3 weeks, just knowing I touched her, she felt it. And my wife, her brother was a college professor, came down with the disease, and he was at the stage where he could not speak at all. And he would sit there and look straight ahead. If you sat to his right, he wouldn't turn and look at you. He just straight ahead. And so she sat in front of him and sang a couple of old songs she thought he might remember, and there was no response. Then she sang, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And he reached out with his hand and put his hand on her hand, and tears came to his eyes. And she knew she had touched him. And that was her last memory. He died 3 weeks later. So, if caregivers understand these dynamics, that they can still communicate love to the other person, and you will get a response when you hit them. Whichever 5 out of the 5, one of them will likely hit them emotionally, because the emotional center of the brain is still alive.
Yeah. And another way that you translated the love languages is into apology languages. Another one of your books that has been released recently. I know that's something that our couples certainly might consider a resource, because conflict being another one of those biggies in marriage. But do you want to unpack this one a little? I know it's kind of near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, what happened was my co-author came to me. She was a counselor here in our city, and she made an appointment to see me. And she said, Gary, I've been using the love language for years in my counseling, but I believe people also have an apology language. I said, what do you mean? She said, I believe that what one person considers to be a sincere apology is not what another person considers to be a sincere apology. I think people are missing each other in their efforts to apologize. And as soon as she said it, I resonated with it, because for years they've been in my office arguing over whether or not one of them apologized. For example, a wife would say, well, I would forgive him if he would just apologize. And he would say, I did apologize. And she'd say, you didn't apologize. And he would say, I told you I was sorry. She said, that's not an apology. So they're arguing over whether or not he apologized. So I said to her, well, what are you going to do with this idea? She said, well, I was hoping that you might join me. We might write a book on the 5 apology languages. I said, well, we need to do some research and make sure it's true.
Yes.
But I'm open to that. So we did. We asked thousands of people all over the country 2 questions. Number 1, when you apologize, what do you typically say or do? Second, when someone's apologizing to you, what do you want to hear them say and do? And their answers fell into 5 categories. I promise you, we were not looking for 5, but I like 5. And so we call them the 5 apology languages. And the whole point of that book is to help people understand that if you're married, you and your spouse probably have a different idea on what a sincere apology looks like and sounds like. Consequently, they may apologize to you and they're very sincere. You don't take it as sincere because it's not what you think a sincere apology ought to look like. And so learning each other's apology language helps you when you need to apologize to do it in a way that's meaningful to the other person. And of course, in that book, we also deal with forgiveness, because apology alone does not restore the relationship. There has to be a response to an apology. And the best response, the biblical response, is to forgive them. And forgiveness has 2 basic ideas. It means we're going to pardon them. That is, we're going to lift the penalty. We're not going to make them pay for what they did. And we're going to remove the barrier. Because when we hurt each other in a marriage, it's putting an emotional barrier between us. And it doesn't go away with the passing of time. It goes away when the person acknowledges and apologizes for it, and this person chooses to forgive them and remove the barrier. Now our relationship can go forward. So I really think that the love languages and the apology languages are 2 essentials to a long-term healthy marriage. You can have a long-term marriage without them, but it won't be a healthy marriage. If it's going to be healthy, we have to keep love alive by speaking each other's language, and we have to deal effectively with our failures, which means apologizing and forgiving. You get those 2 things down, and you're going to be moving in a positive direction to having a lifelong, positive, healthy marriage.
Well, and I can imagine that those are some of the things that you teach when you go and you do your marriage conferences, along with your other books that you have used as your marriage conferences there. But now, if someone wanted to know, how do they figure out their apology language and their love languages? There's tests in the back of the books, correct?
Yes, they're in the back of the book, and they're also online at 5lovelanguages.com. You just go to 5lovelanguages.com and you push profiles or quizzes, and there's one for example, on the love languages, there's one for married couples, there's one for single adults, there's one for teenagers, and they're questions that you can ask a child. And so that's the love language. But also there's one that says apology, and you take the apology quiz, and it'll tell you what you consider to be a part of a sincere apology. And with apologizing, it's not necessarily, one is super more important than the other. Sometimes 1 or 2 of them kind of go together. And if they hear both of those together, they feel like it's sincere. If they don't, then it doesn't sound sincere to them. So, and those are free online. In fact, they told me that 100 million people have taken those love language quizzes.
Just online. And
online.
That doesn't even account for all the people that took it through their, on the back of the book, through their small group, like we did early in our marriage and all that. So think about how many millions and millions of people have had their relations improved, even just by taking the quiz.
Yeah, it's super, super encouraging to me. Of course, obviously I hope people read the book, because the book is much more in depth in terms of how to do this and all of that. But just taking the quiz helps if they apply it once they learn each other's language.
Yeah. Well, and now too, your team and Moody, and you have a whole group, and you continue to think of ways to make these things more relevant. In the new age, you have an app you have your radio programs, and you actually are doing something even with assessments, correct? When people are either trying to improve their marriage or pre-marriage assessments.
Uh, yes, the parrots, Les and Leslie Parrott, have the quiz Better Love, and we make it available on our website, and it takes you to their website. Now there is a charge for that because it's much more in depth, and love language is just a part of that. But yeah, we hope that couples will use that as well because it's a great tool.
For both, there's the pre-married application, and then those who are married and who just want to have a better kind of a snapshot and a playbook of what's going on in their marriage and ways they can improve. But it's just great application of what you're doing. It's still so current and fresh, even though you published it in 1992.
Well, I think the need for emotional love will be with us forever. It's not going to go away. The fact that the book has been out 30 years and every year sells more than the year before says the need is still there, and the need's going to be there for our children and our great grandchildren down the road because they're human. So my hope is that the book will continue to be there for people. They'll find it and use it because it does make a huge difference in the marriage relationship.
Well, and your other books too, the ones that you use quite a bit when you do your marital conferences, based on that was actually your first book, wasn't it?
Yeah, The Marriage You've Always Wanted. Originally, it was called Toward a Growing Marriage, and we've revised it a few times and changed the title, and now it's The Marriage You've Always Wanted. And yes, that is the book on which I build my Saturday marriage conferences. We call it the 5 Love Language Marriage Conference because people recognize the love language concept, but it's far more than just the love language concept. That's one of the things we cover, but the rest of it comes out of that book. And we challenge the people once the conference is over to take that book, The Marriage You've Always Wanted, and read it a chapter a week and answer the questions at the end of the chapter, and then sit down and share your answers with each other. What can we learn out of this chapter? And the people who follow up with that are the ones that are going to be growing more after the conference is over than they grew that day because they've got tools, they've got a map now, they've got a road that they're on, and life can their marriage can really be enhanced.
Well, that just sounds like such a wonderful thing and a great resource for marriage champions. You have so many, but so inspiring to just hear not only about the book and your speaking, but how people can actually take it and apply it, whether they start with their small group and then do that and then go home and work on it together. Now, I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about your memoirs.
Okay.
I loved this book. And I think anyone who's ever heard of you is thinking, man, I would love to know, you kind of base it on your lessons that you learned. Did you have some favorites you'd like to share?
Well, I really did enjoy writing that book because it took me back through my life's journey. It's called Life Lessons and Love Languages. And I was going to call it How I Became Me. But the publisher came up with this title because they said a lot of people know the love language, they don't know your name. So let's put love languages in the title. And that was a good idea, I think. But I just went back through my life asking myself, where did I learn certain things? I'll just give you one example. For example, I had finished college and I kind of had the idea, I'm a college grad now. I can do about anything. Just turn me loose, And I went to Colorado Springs to the Navigators headquarters, a Christian group. And the program was for a summer. They would take college graduates, and you had an 8-hour job where you worked, and mine happened to be in the print shop. And then we met once a week with a small group. And then we had a mentor that met with us once a week. And then we could go to the conferences that were held on their grounds. So mine was in the print shop. And they assigned me to run a folder that took huge pieces of paper, made about 8 folds down to little tiny booklets called Beginning with Christ. And so they showed me how to do it. And I thought, yeah, okay, I can do that. I worked all day Monday and I couldn't get it to work. So the next morning, they gave me another lesson on how a folder works. And I tried all day and I couldn't get it. That went on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Friday morning, I was having my time with God, sitting on a rock outside. And I came to John 15, verse 5, which says, where Jesus said, I'm the vine, you're the branches. You stay connected to me, you bear fruit. But without me, you can do nothing. And I broke down and wept. And I said, God, I can't even run a dumb folder without you. And when I got through weeping, I finally said, God, I'm asking you to teach me how to run that folder. And I went in, and that folder just went like that. All summer long, I ran that folder. But I have never forgotten that lesson. Without God, we can do nothing. But the flip side of that is, with God, we can accomplish all of his purposes for us. So it's a matter of staying connected to the vine and realizing it's not you, it's God, and we're dependent on him for everything. I'm just glad, Amy, that I learned that lesson at that stage in my life and not 30 years later, So it's those kind of lessons that I share in the book that I learned along the way in my educational journey and in my vocational journey, and with my family and from my children. I learned a lot of things from my children. And one of the things I learned from my son is how to handle anger.
Yeah. That was another one of your topics that you consider very important. Do you feel comfortable sharing that story? You probably do, because you put it in your book.
Yeah, I can share it. He was probably 13 or 14 maybe, and he was in his room one night, and I was in there with him, and we got into an argument. I don't even remember the topic, but I was yelling at him and screaming at him, and he was yelling at me and screaming at me, and we were both saying hateful things to each other. And in the middle of it, he just walked out of his room and walked across the living room, walked out the front door and slammed the door. And when the door slammed, I woke up and I said, oh God, I thought I was further along than this, yelling at the son I love. And I sat down on the couch and just wept. I mean, I wept. And my wife came in and tried to console me. And she said, honey, that was not your fault. I heard the whole thing. He started that. He's got to learn how to respect you. But it's hard to console a sinner. So she finally gave up and left the room. And I just poured my heart out to God and asked God to forgive me for yelling at my son. And eventually he came back in and I said, Derek, could you come in here a minute, son? And he did. He sat down. And I just poured my heart out to him and apologized. I didn't know anything about apology languages in those days, but I just poured my heart out and how wrong I was. And I said, Derek, a father should never talk to a son the way I talk to you. And I know I said hateful things, and that's not how I feel about you. I love you. And I just poured my heart out, and I said, I hope you can forgive me. And he said, Dad, that was not your fault. I started that. And when I was walking up the road, I asked God to forgive me. And I'm going to ask you to forgive me. And we hugged each other and we cried, hugged and cried. And when we finally sat down again, I said, Derek, why don't we both try to learn how to handle anger in a different way? What if we try this? The next time you're angry with me, you just say, Dad, I'm angry. Can we talk? And I'll sit down and listen to you. And the next time I'm angry with you, I'll just say, Derek, I'm angry. Can we talk? And let's just learn how to talk our way through anger rather than yelling our way through anger. That's why I sometimes say that was one of the saddest nights of my life because of my failure, and one of the happiest nights of my life because my son just demonstrated that he knows how to apologize. And I knew someday he'd likely be married and he would need to know how to apologize because there are no perfect husbands. So, yeah, one of the most sobering questions, Amy, that I ever asked myself along the journey in raising our children is, what if my children turn out to be like me? What if they drive the way I drive? What if they would treat people the way I treat people? What if they handle anger the way I handle anger? And right on down the line. It's a sobering question if parents are willing to ask that. And in my life, I made a lot of changes along the way after asking that question because I didn't want my children to be like me in certain areas. And so if you really want to grow as a parent, I would suggest you might ask that question along the way.
Yeah, That is so convicting. And there's something I do want to bring up, Dr. Chapman, because so many people may know you, by the love languages or by the kitschy, my love language is chocolate. But people don't know that you are an ordained pastor and that your faith is paramount. And in fact, you and your wife wanted to be missionaries.
Yeah.
And how important your faith is. So I wanted to make sure I gave you some time to explain that a little bit.
Well, there's no question about that. My favorite hymn is "I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene and wonder that he could love me, a sinner condemned and clean." I think that's true of every Christian if they reflect on it, because we are what we are by the grace of God. And yes, when I was 17 years of age, I felt God was leading me into some kind of ministry. And I only knew there was two things you could do as a vocation, as a minister. One would be a pastor, and one would be a missionary. And at that time, I pictured missionaries as working in the jungle.
Yeah.
And I didn't like snakes, so I figured God must want me to be a pastor. So when I went to Moody Bible Institute, I took what they called the pastor's course. It's a 3-year course. And later I went to Wheaton College, because at that time Moody was just an institute, a 3-year school. Now they offer degrees. And I got my degree in anthropology because I thought, if I'm going, by that time I felt like God wanted me to be a missionary. And so I thought, I need to study cultures. And so I did that. And then went to seminary. And then we talked to the mission board about, going to the mission field. And my vision at that time would be to teach nationals how to reach their country. And they said, well, that'll probably be in a seminary or a college, and it would be an advantage if you had the Ph.D. And so we talked about it. I never even thought about that. And we talked about it and thought, well, okay, let's do it. So we went back to seminary. By this time we had a child. We went back to seminary 3 years and got the Ph.D. And then we officially applied to the mission board. We were going to go to Nigeria, Africa, to a seminary there. And we applied and went through that process and got turned down because of my wife's health. And they said, we can't send her to Africa. And it was very disillusioning for us. And she was feeling guilty because she said, I'm keeping you from going to the mission field. And you can imagine the pain of that, and I was just frustrated. I mean, God, why did you lead us to do the PhD and now you're closing the door? So we went through a lot of struggle there, and also kind of upset with the mission board because she didn't think she was that bad, and I didn't think she was either. And, so, I mean, it's a struggle time for us. And eventually, of course, I thought, well, I guess I'll just teach here in this country, and I did teach for 3 years here in this country in a college. And I realized in those 3 years, I loved teaching. I didn't really care for all the academic stuff, preparing exams and grading papers and reading essays. And so I was invited to come to the church that I later spent 50 years on staff and start a college ministry. And I thought, man, I can work with college students and not mess with the academics, just deal with the real stuff. And for 10 years, we did that. Started Bible studies on campus, Wake Forest University. Sunday morning taught a class for college students, 100, 120 every Sunday. Every Friday night, college students in our house, for a Q&A for 2 hours. And I mean, it was just great, And then went on to do singles ministry and other things. But pretty early on, I got pushed into counseling because I would lead a class on marriage for adult married couples. And the ones that were hurting would want to talk. And I'd taken some courses in seminary on counseling. I didn't get a master's or anything in it. I took what they offered. They didn't even offer a master's in those days. And so counseling then became a major part of my ministry. And all of my books grew out of my counseling. And so when they would publish books in other countries, they would always send us copies. And Carolyn and I would pray about, the country and the book, and that God would use it. And one night I was opening up a box of books, and I looked up on the couch, and Carolyn was crying. And I said, Carolyn, what's wrong? And she said, nothing's wrong. I just remember we wanted to be missionaries. And now your books are all over the world. And I wept. It's when I realized, oh,
Yeah.
That's why we didn't get accepted.
Yeah. That's
You
just
know,
so amazing
yeah.
when you think about how God used that and have sent your books all around the world. And I know when I asked you, probably the question that everyone's wondering, what's next? What's left on your bucket list?
Well, when I celebrated my 50th anniversary, I officially retired from the church. But they let me keep my office. They let me keep my assistant, and I'm in the office I'm in the office now, and I'm there every day if I'm in town. But I'm free now to speak more, other places. But at any rate, uh, some people ask me, "What's on your bucket list? What's on your bucket list?" And I thought, I don't know if I have one. If you mean I want to go here or go there or go fishing or go, I don't think I have one. I said, but if you want me to have a bucket list, I'll put one thing in it. I would like to accomplish everything that God has in mind for my life. I said, I've already told God, when you're through, I'm through. but I would like to accomplish everything that He has in mind for me. So I'm still writing and I'm still speaking more than ever. Of course, COVID's over now. Well, it's still around, but we're back now, at least attending meetings.
Yeah.
And
You're out and about.
yeah, and so still doing my radio, which you mentioned earlier, and all of that, and still seeing people. I'm not actually doing long-term counseling now. Because 30 years ago, we helped start an independent Christian counseling center in our city. 3 churches went together. They now have 12 full-time counselors, Christian counselors in that center. So there's a place to refer people. But I still will see people once or twice, to learn what the situation is and channel them to someone who can help them long term if that's needed.
Well, that is just wonderful. And man, I know all of us just feel like we've just gotten this front seat view in your life and just been so wonderful to talk to you, Dr. Chapman. This is just a dream come true. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Amy. I enjoyed chatting with you and appreciate what you and the Marriage Initiative is doing in San Antonio and other places as well. So, we all are gifted, and God just wants us to take the gifts He's given us and use them, in whatever way He leads us. And we're a family, and every single person's important. And there's a whole lot of people out there that don't yet have a relationship with God. And I hope they will see our lives and be attracted to our lives and recognize that we are who we are because of the grace of God. So keep up the good work with what you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And Marriage Champions, if you want to find out more about Dr. Chapman, you can always find us at marriageinitiative.org.